The first thing I want to say is really the battle for the NHS starts right now, doesn't it? Right now, with these elections that we've got coming up in London. They are crucial. We need more Labour councils in London so that they can fight to protect services and protect the NHS against privatisation in the next year and beyond. But also we need Labour MEPs in Brussels, because as I'm going to come on to explain, the NHS needs to be a European election issue this year because of the EU-US trade treaty that's coming along. Come May, June, we need MEPs in the European Parliament who are going to vote to protect the NHS from that trade treaty, and that's why it's absolutely essential that we get that message out as we get into the European election campaign as well. But what's going on? I think the Assembly report was really excellent and well timed, because I think London is seeing the damage probably quicker than the rest of the country. The changes that are being made to services here are happening at a frightening speed. We have seen not far from here what this government tried to do at Lewisham. And I know we've got Lewisham campaigners in the room too today. Hi Joss and anyone else if I've missed you. But I think London needs to kind of just focus on what they tried to do there, because it could happen to anybody else. A successful hospital, a good A&E, a community that desperately needs those facilities given the deprivation that there is. All of a sudden the government comes along and thinks it can just take away that A&E to solve a problem elsewhere in the NHS. The arrogance of it was breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking. It broke every rule in the book, and yet Hunt thought he could do it. In fact, he just wasn't listening. He was going to do it. And thank God that the people of Lewisham, with support from the rest of London but all over the country, stood up to him and took him all the way to the High Court, and then won in the High Court. It was a famous victory, and it was a victory for everybody actually, certainly for the whole of London, but for the rest of the country, because it was a message to an arrogant government that we're not going to let you just carve up the NHS in any way that you want. Of course, he came back to Parliament to try and railroad through the same powers that the High Court wouldn't give him. I mean, again, does it get more arrogant than that? I don't think it does. But London has got, I would say, the prime example of a government that is prepared to carve up and break up the NHS without any regard for the people here, for the staff who work in those hospitals. We're seeing the threat elsewhere. We're seeing in West London massive changes to A&E, which this government has been fighting for some time now. Brutal changes actually to the NHS. Huge risk with services at a time when services are already under pressure. And there are other changes too, which we could go through across the whole of London. And the point is this: the report from the Assembly made this clear earlier this week, and we have demonstrated this as a Shadow Health team. A&E is under unprecedented pressure. Unprecedented pressure. Last year, around 1 million people waited more than 4 hours in A&E. In London, I think the figure was around 250,000 people. That is taking A&E back to the bad old days in London in the mid-90s. You'll all remember when there was just chaotic scenes in A&Es like King's, St Thomas's. This was what we had, and A&E in London is going back to that. The last full year that we've just had, that's just ended, has been the worst year in a decade in A&E. And let's remember, this last year was the first full year after Mr Cameron's reorganisation of the NHS. Remember that, the reorganisation that he said would never happen, and the reorganisation that nobody in London voted for. Well, this is what's happening to the NHS. A&E is the barometer of the whole health and care system. If there's a problem anywhere in the health service, in the end it shows up as pressure in A&E, because if you can't discharge a patient from the ward back home because there's not enough social care at home, the ward becomes blocked, and then A&E staff can't admit to the ward. So the pressure backs up through A&E. It's the barometer. And this barometer is telling us that the NHS is now in severe distress, and there are severe storms ahead. And that's what we've got to wake people up to now in the weeks running up to these elections. It's that serious. Why is A&E under such stress? Because we're seeing massive cuts to primary care. I said that London is feeling it worse than everywhere else. I'm sure you hear from your neighbours, your friends, your colleagues. How many people do you hear saying, oh, I'm ringing the surgery every morning at 9 o'clock, but I just can't get an appointment. They're telling me there's nothing available for days. Getting a GP appointment is getting harder and harder under this government. So that's what's happened to GP surgery. Then you look at mental health. Mental health. In the bill, the Health and Social Care Act, thanks to a Labour amendment, it was secured for the first time that there should be parity between mental health and physical health. Well, that's just being completely ignored now, and the government are cutting mental health faster than the rest of the NHS, and they've just approved another cut to the tariff for this year, which will see mental health, already in crisis, go further downhill. Now, I don't know how that can be possible in London when we're already seeing intolerable pressure on mental health services, where people are being held in severe mental breakdown, being held in police cells or on camp beds in offices. You know, this is what is going on. There are no beds for people in this highly vulnerable situation, and yet there are more cuts on the way. And all that will do is pile even more pressure on London's A&Es, London's hospitals that are already struggling to cope. And then you look at social care. Massive cuts to social care. Under this government, the Nuffield Trust has estimated that around 250,000 people have had home care withdrawn. So they used to get some support in the home, and now they're getting nothing. And again, it's not rocket science, is it? Where do those people end up? If they're not coping at home, they start to drift towards hospital. And again, we need Labour councils in London to protect social care and to stop these horrendous cuts that are obviously piling pressure on the system. So this is what's happening to the NHS. It's worrying. London's NHS is breaking up before our eyes, and that's the message we've got to get into these local elections and into the European elections. Labour councils to act as the first line of defence for the NHS, to challenge what's going on, to hold the commissioners to account, to speak up for patients, and to speak for core Labour values. You know, I have said that, you know, I think even we let the market in too far to the NHS. We can't carry on letting this happen, because in the end, if we do, it will devour the NHS and everything that's precious about it. And that's why I'm absolutely clear that the NHS needs to be seen as our preferred provider, that we repeal the Health and Social Care Act 2012. And Labour proudly stands for a public NHS again. That's where we should be, and that's where I want you to be in these elections, fighting the privatisation that we're seeing gathering pace across the system. But that's important in the European elections too, and Lucy and colleagues have been raising this issue with me. You know, if we don't get the European Parliament that we would want with more Labour voices in it, then the threat to the NHS moves up to a whole different level, and our ability to protect our own NHS starts to fall out of our hands. You know, it kind of falls away from us. Why? It's because of this trade treaty that's being negotiated right now in Brussels. This is a treaty between the EU and the US, which has the aim of some positive aims in terms of promoting trade between two countries. But if it stays as it is, it could have the effect of opening up our public services to US corporate entities, and particularly the National Health Service. And the issue is, it's the combination of the two things. It's the Health and Social Care Act having exposed the NHS to the full glare of European competition law. That's the first problem. But then if you lay on top of that this EU-US treaty, it basically then throws the door wide open for US private health companies to start legally challenging the NHS from there. And then we are in a totally different world. And our ability, as I say, to protect our own NHS is basically no longer in our own hands. It's that serious. So this week I went to Brussels to argue for an exemption for health and for the NHS from this emerging EU-US trade treaty. And I got a good hearing, and there were some encouraging signs. But it is absolutely essential that the European Parliament has people in it who are going to vote to make sure there's an exemption for health and for the NHS when that treaty comes before it, probably later this year. So this time, perhaps unlike European elections past, we have to work very hard to explain to people what's at stake, that the European elections are elections about the future of the National Health Service and who is going to speak up for the NHS. The Tories have been utterly silent on this whole issue. In fact, it's worse. They've said that they think health should be in the scope of the EU-US trade treaty. Their lapdogs, the Lib Dems, the Yellow Tories, you'll know all about them here in this community. Well, they've said nothing as well, not a word from them. UKIP, even worse. They actively have called for the privatisation of the NHS. Their last manifesto said it should be put out to full open tender. That's the UKIP position. This explains why they're all silent on this issue, because it's their policy. Tory policy, Lib Dem policy, UKIP policy. Who's going to speak up for the NHS? It's got to be us. It's got to be Labour. And it's got to be now in these elections. Speaking up for the NHS at local level in the council elections in London. Speaking up for the NHS in Europe. In the European elections, and taking that strong message and building from there into the general election next year. You know, I believe, for the reasons I've just given you, with the threat it faces from the Health and Social Care Act and from the EU-US Treaty, that this next election is utterly pivotal in terms of the future of the NHS. I am not sure what there will be left to say if we can't win in 2015. I am absolutely certain that the NHS can't survive 2 terms of Cameron and 2 terms of this government, such is the speed with which it's being broken up. You know, we do have to make it number 2 or even number 1 issue in these elections, in the general election. It's that important, and it's down to us. We have got to be there at the forefront, leading that fight, Labour at the front of it, fighting for the NHS it created, and now going out there to fight again to save it and rebuild it for the 21st century. And as I said to you, I want an NHS based on Labour's core values. I'm not neutral about who provides NHS services. I believe passionately in the public NHS and what it represents, a service based on people before profit. Now, if this party can't get behind that, then, you know, quite frankly, you know, people will ask, well, where are Labour? What are they for? That's why we are behind that message. That is the Labour message we're taking forward. I'm proud of the things we did to put it back on its feet when we were in government. But now I believe the time has come to fight for it again and to cement it as a public service for the 21st century. That's what's at stake. I know you all share this passion, because you wouldn't be here on a Saturday morning if you didn't. But that's now what we've got to do to go into these elections and show what Nye Bevan said all of those years, show that we are the people now who've got both the faith and the fight to protect our NHS. Thanks everybody, thanks for listening.